My name is Dr. Vinicius Mariano de Carvalho. I'm currently the director of King's Brazil Institute at King's College London, and just starting also the role as Vice Dean International for the Faculty of Social Science and Public Policy in King's. Brazil Institute is an institution or a part of King's that exists for already almost 14 years now, 14 years, I think, yeah. And our big role at King's is exactly to build up bridges, first between Brazil and UK, of course, academically and with an external audience as well. But most recently, we realized how important it is also to use Brazil Institute as a sort of point of contact of other cultures that are in interaction around the world and in some way cross their paths with Brazil. In this process, we most recently started to have a closer dialogue with Center for Mexican Studies from the UNAM, for instance, that is in King's as well, and with the Camões Center, also part of King's College London for quite a long time. And we start more and more collaborating and having events together. So also we start to interact and dialogue with other actors that are doing research that's not specifically related to Brazil, but again, as I said, there are points of connections and interactions. I think that's the main key point here, of how we interact globally and using this perspective of an interaction that happens most of the time in what we call Global South. And I think today's event, it's a good example of this transformation that Brazil Institute is having, and thanks to the collaboration of many of our partners and colleagues. One of those, and most important probably among us today here, it's Hugo Cardoso, who teaches in the University of Coimbra and, in the University of Lisbon, and has a research focus on language contact involving Portuguese language. He has worked already with the Creole in Suriname, but also in South Asia, especially in Diu, in Malabar coast and Sri Lanka. And Hugo is coming to work with us today or this week, or as a visitor, as an exchange in the Erasmus Plus program. We were a little bit worried after Brexit if we could still benefit from Erasmus partnership. And I think Hugo has been a good proof that we still can count on it, at least for a while. So I would like to introduce you to Hugo Cardoso, who will be giving this lecture today about documentation and description of Indo-Portuguese creoles. As I said, this is a partnership among many of our colleagues in King's, and among these colleagues that has been a great supporter of Brazil Institute and a great colleague, it's Professor Anania Kabir. She is the professor of English literature here at King's and has a research that is quite connections and of intersections about culture, modern cultures, but also traditional cultures, and transnationalization and creolization in particular. So I think we have a great community of colleagues that will be looking at these aspects here today. Hugo will be presenting, and just after his lecture, Anania will be responding to it, and then we will open for a discussion with you that are joined here. I just would like to remember you that we will be recording this event for register, for memory, and exactly because we also think that it's a great opportunity to have these two together, and we should document this moment for the posterity and for support research for those who cannot attend today. I would like to ask you if you could keep your microphone closed. We are using a meeting mode for the Zoom, so remember to keep your mic off. If you feel comfortable and confident and would like to open your cameras, it's welcome. So at least we have a good impression that we are talking to other people in other parts of the world. I will stop to talk now and let you with Hugo. And again, just to finish here, to thank you very much, Hugo, to join us here. He managed to come to London indeed. So we are doing this event on Zoom, but with Hugo here in London. Thank you so much. And Hugo is with you.
Thank you very much, Vinicius. Thank you also to Anania, to the Camões Center here at King's College, and everyone at King's College for welcoming me and hosting me. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. in London. Even though we can't meet in person, we have this technology to still chat. And let me just start by sharing with you my presentation. I hope you can see the slides. Okay, so this should be working. All right. So when Vinicius invited me for this particular talk to talk a little bit about my past research concerning the Indo-Portuguese creoles, I thought, okay, yes, I can do that, but it's only fair to also mention all of the work that was done before me, so you get an impression of how these languages have come to be known, how far they've been documented, they've been described, what has been done, and what remains to be done. So that's why I organized this talk around the topic of documentation and description of Indo-Portuguese creoles, because this is one area in which I've been active for the past few years. And for those of you who are not familiar with these two concepts of Indo-Portuguese to start with, and creoles as well, let me just try to very quickly and very briefly answer the question, what are these languages? So what are the Indo-Portuguese creoles? We can say just very briefly that we are talking about the characteristic, but not the only languages of the Asian Portuguese communities of South Asia, and beyond the Asian Portuguese communities. So it's a little complex, but these languages, even though they are especially associated with these communities that assume a Eurasian origin, they have been used by other communities. And these languages in linguistics are classified as Creole languages for a number of different reasons, and different authors will appeal to different reasons to call them creoles. For example, because they originate from intense language contact, so they are the product of contact between different languages, because they show a degree of linguistic hybridism which prevents a straightforward phylogenetic classification on the basis of only one of the donor languages, of the ancestor languages, because they show certain structural features that are thought to be typical of Creole languages in general, and because they arose in a socio-historical context which is similar to that of other Creole languages, for instance, the ones of the Caribbean. And by this, I mean essentially the displacement and contact of populations as a result of all of the dynamics of European overseas expansion. So this is very superficial. I'm aware of that. It would take very, very long to unpack all of these arguments, and some of them are more convincing than others. But if any of you will be following the workshop that I'll be teaching next week, we'll have a chance to delve into these questions. But for the time being, this is the reason why they are usually classified among the rather large family of Creole languages around the world. They are, of course, the result of the expansion of Portuguese in Asia, South Asia in particular, of course, but Asia in general. And this is a process that really began at the very beginning, the late 15th century, but really at the beginning of the 16th century. And it's a complex process that we will also have a chance to talk about next week at the workshop. But the dynamics very briefly are these. The Portuguese first established a number of outposts on the so-called Malabar coast, which is the area that you see in this oval in southwestern India. And it was from there that the rest of the exploration of coastal Asia happened over the course of the following century and beyond. So the expansion of Portuguese obviously accompanied the expansion of the Portuguese. And the creoles that we'll be talking about today are, in effect, a result of this expansion and a result of the contact and transformation that Portuguese produced when it came into contact with a host of Asian languages across the coast of this continent. In fact, the Portuguese language, once it was established in coastal Asia from the 16th century onwards, for a long time, it served as a bit of a lingua franca. You may be aware of that, or maybe not, but just to give you an idea, here's a quote from the 18th century from a British trader and sailor Alexander Hamilton, who knew the context of the Asian trade in the 18th century, and he wrote at some point that along the seacoasts, the Portuguese have left a vestige of the language, though much corrupted. Yet it is the language that most Europeans learn first to qualify them for general converse with one another, as well as with the inhabitants of India. This is relevant. This quote, there are several quotes like this that you can find in other sources of the same time and even later and even earlier. But this is interesting for two reasons. First of all, it indicates that for at least the Europeans who went to Asia, it served as a bit of a lingua franca. So it was the language they communicated in between themselves and with local populations. But there's also this reference to the language being corrupted, and that's interesting. Obviously, these days, the concept of linguistic corruption doesn't really apply. So this is a sign of the times when this was written. But it is an indication that there was this idea that what really did circulate and function as a lingua franca was not Portuguese as spoken in Europe, for example, but something that showed the signs of contact and transformation. And this Asian variety of Portuguese, or these Asian variety of Portuguese that did circulate, are related to the history of the Indo-Portuguese creoles that we are dealing with today. So the formation of Creole languages as a result of this historical process in Asia is not, didn't just happen in South Asia. We'll be focusing on South Asia, but this is in fact, as you can see from this map, this is in fact a pan-Asian phenomenon. So it occurred in many other parts of Asia, but it is essentially a coastal phenomenon. And what you see on this map, this is not a complete list of the places where Portuguese used to be spoken at some point in history, but it gives you an indication of the dispersal of places where it happened. There is a significant concentration on South Asia. And in fact, when we speak of Indo-Portuguese, we are concentrating out of this string of creoles that formed all over Asia, we are concentrating on the ones that were spoken and still are spoken within that rectangle, right? So South Asia. But it's interesting to notice that there are other creoles, other relatives elsewhere in Asia. Now, if this gives you an impression of several places where the language used to be spoken, if I show you the next map, you will see that the locations in which the creoles are still spoken, so that where they have survived is much, much reduced. So again, we are talking about a significant concentration in South Asia, which I'll give you some more information about in a moment. But you also have languages, Creole languages, based on Portuguese in Malacca and Macau. Okay, now if we zoom in, because this map was a little wide, but if we zoom in on South Asia and on the domain of Indo-Portuguese itself, I can give you a little bit more detail. And this is a map that I produced for my PhD dissertation in 2009, in which I tried to locate a number of places where the literature mentioned that the Portuguese language or a Creole had been at some point spoken. So quite a few places. It's again a coastal phenomenon, but one that goes all the way from Diu in the northwest to the Bay of Bengal, to Bengal itself, and in fact, as we will see in a moment, even beyond. Okay. And again, if this is the maximum dispersal and distribution of this phenomenon in history, the next map is going to show you what remains. And what remains is just a very small subset of all of these creoles that we know were spoken in the past. In red, I had to make some adaptations to the 2009 map because, well, new discoveries come to light or other phenomena occur over time. And if you look at Cochin in southwestern India, you see a line through it, because when this map was produced, there was indeed a Portuguese Creole spoken in Cochin, but apparently it is no longer spoken since the last speakers, I'll tell you in a moment, passed away in 2010. So that's what that line means. And it also shows you how fragile all of these languages are. On the other hand, in Sri Lanka, I've added the city of Jaffna because as a result of one of the projects that I will tell you about in this talk, it was possible to locate a number of speakers in the city of Jaffna in northern Sri Lanka, whereas before, in 2009, it was considered that the language was no longer spoken in that city. Something interesting about these languages is that even though we classify them all as Indo-Portuguese creoles, even though they are all somehow related to each other and to this historical process of transformation and contact that Portuguese underwent, the fact is that they developed in contact with different local languages, right? So whereas in the northwestern portion of India, the dominant languages of the region are Gujarati in Diu and Daman and Marathi in Korlai, so Indo-Aryan languages. In southern India and in Sri Lanka, the dominant languages are Dravidian languages, so Malayalam on the Malabar coast, so modern-day Kerala, and Tamil in the parts of Sri Lanka in which the language is still more active. But we also have to consider the historical influence of Sinhala on Sri Lanka Portuguese, because we know for a fact that the language was also spoken in the Sinhala majority areas of the country. Therefore, if Tamil is the most relevant local language for the current varieties of Sri Lanka Portuguese, Sinhala may have been so as well in other areas. Based on this typological difference between the Dravidian languages in the south and the Indo-Aryan languages of the north, in the 19th century, a distinction was proposed between the group of Goro Portuguese creoles, which would be the ones that developed out of contact with Indo-Aryan languages, or that is Indo-European languages, and Dravido-Portuguese, the ones developed in contact with Dravidian languages. So this is a proposal that still makes sense because we can, one of the interesting research questions about these languages is to what extent the similarities of these substrate languages may produce similarities in the creoles. Another aerial proposal and classification or clustering would be this. So the languages in the north west of India were at some point called the Norteiro Indo-Portuguese creoles, the Norteiro creoles because they were north of Goa. The creoles of the Malabar coast can be classified and grouped into the category of the Malabar Indo-Portuguese creoles. And then there's Sri Lanka Indo-Portuguese or Sri Lanka Portuguese, or as it was known throughout most of its history until the 20th century, Ceylon Portuguese. Right, so now that we know a little bit about these languages, where they're spoken, which ones are still around, let me just briefly guide you through the linguistic records that we have for these languages. So what sources do we have, and how much documentation, how much description has been done on these languages? And to answer this question, it is, or when you look at this and when we try to organize the production of knowledge, of linguistic knowledge about these languages, we recognize three different phases. The first phase is very interesting because it's quite early, even for Creole languages around the world, it's quite early because there is, from the very beginning of the 19th century, there is a significant production of texts and even descriptions, grammars and dictionaries, for example, translations as well. But in this particular case, it is really only about Ceylon Portuguese, that is Sri Lanka Portuguese. So this is the first phase, the early 19th century or throughout the 19th century, where you find a lot of sources that essentially fulfilled a practical function, right? So these were sources and resources produced about this language, essentially by religious or non-religious colonial agents, let's say, and to fulfill colonial needs and religious needs. So that's why from the early 19th century, you start getting, for example, right at the beginning, in 1811, you already have the second edition of something that's quite interesting. It's called a grammatical arrangement on the method of learning the corrupted Portuguese as spoken in India, but it is essentially a grammar of Ceylon Portuguese, right? So this group of sources starts with a grammar. And in fact, the second reference that I give you there, the 1819 dictionary by Fox, is also quite interesting because it is a dictionary, but it also includes what Fox called a compendium of the Ceylon Portuguese language. And this compendium, again, is essentially a sketch grammar of the language. So the first one by Beringer was published at the government press in Colombo. The second one was published by the Wesleyan Mission Press in Colombo. So one is associated with missionary activities. The other one is associated with civil needs of the British government in Ceylon. But they are both oriented towards teaching this language. So it was, in a sense, it was recognized by all of these agents that this language was significantly important in Ceylon, that it was useful for civil agents and missionaries to learn it, right? So Fox's dictionary is also interesting because it is trilingual. It's in Ceylon Portuguese, in Sinhalese, and in English. And then later on, you have Ceylon Portuguese and English language vocabulary by Callaway, and you have a series of other word lists and dictionaries, mostly produced by the Wesleyan Mission in Colombo. Then in addition to that, you also have religious literature, and here there are several different types. You have texts produced originally in Ceylon Portuguese, and you have translations, be it of the Bible or of liturgical works that were necessary for sorry, I'm trying to get rid of, okay, yes. Now I can read everything. That were necessary for religious practice. Then in addition to that, there's another source which is quite interesting, very interesting, I would say, and very significant, the Neville manuscript, which is kept here in London at the British Library. It is a manuscript that was produced for or by Hugh Neville, who was a British officer in Ceylon around this time. And it is a collection of oral traditions of the so-called Berger population, or the Indo-Portuguese or Ceylon Portuguese population of the island. And I can't see it right now because I'm sharing the screen, but I noticed earlier on that Shihan de Silva Jayasuriya has joined this meeting. And I'm very happy that she did, because she has published one of the editions of this manuscript. Okay, so here are some examples of the production of this first phase. You have the cover of the Beringer 1811 grammar. You have one of the pages of Fox's trilingual dictionary on the right. And then just to exemplify the type of religious texts that were produced around this time, you have on the left what is essentially the translation of the Book of Common Prayer of the Anglican Church, printed here in London in 1826. And you have a translation of the Gospel according to St. Matthew, also published in London. And these are only two of several such sources. This dynamic that we notice for Sri Lanka has no parallel in any of the other areas of Asia when it comes to the local Creole. So it's something quite unique of Sri Lanka or Ceylon, to the extent that someone who will become important in the second phase of the documentation and description of these languages, a Goan priest called Sebastião Delgado, in 1900, so right at the end of the 19th century, wrote the following: "It is no wonder that the Creole of Ceylon enjoys a preeminent position among the colonial Portuguese dialects and is the most well-known abroad. It is spoken as a mother tongue by almost all Eurasians or burghers and learned out of commercial, domestic, or religious convenience by many Europeans and natives. It has a considerable literature and keeps producing books, booklets, and periodicals, which can be clearly seen to have numerous readers. It is a cultivated and defined dialect of exuberant vitality. So this is something, this depiction or this description of the situation of Ceylon Portuguese could not have been applied to any of the other creoles. They did not have the same production. They did not receive the same attention in this first phase of records. And now that we mentioned Delgado, we can transit to the second phase, because he's one of the main actors in the second phase. And the second phase is the turn of the century. So it's the late 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, where there is a different kind of attention given to these languages, because this is where Creole studies as a scientific discipline begins. And we see the production of scholarly studies for many of these Creoles, not just Ceylon anymore, but the others as well. One of the main actors, and perhaps the most important one here, is Hugo Schuchart. Hugo Schuchart is often credited with being the founder of Creole studies as a scientific discipline. He was a German philologist and linguist who worked for a lot of his life in Austria at the University of Graz. And he was interested in language contact across the world. He wrote about many of the Creole languages, and not just Creole languages. And it's interesting to notice that the Portuguese-based ones were one of his main focuses, and specifically the ones of Asia. As I'll show you in a moment, he had an interesting, but very common at the time, technique or strategy to collect data, because he could not do fieldwork himself. So he wrote letters. He wrote letters to people in the field and tried to get as much information as he could. And it was on the basis of these materials that were dispatched to him that he wrote articles, descriptive grammatical articles about the Creoles of Cochin, of Diu, of Mangalore, one about Indo-Portuguese in general, and then the Creoles of Mahé and Cannanore, and a manuscript that wasn't published in his life about the Creole of Ceylon, which once again was translated and edited in 1999 by Shehan de Silva Jayasuriya, who is attending this talk. He was an inspiration to Sebastião Delgado, the gentleman who wrote the quote we just read before. And Sebastião Delgado was a priest from Goa, who was inspired to do something similar. So he also collected data and published his own descriptive articles about some of the Creoles that Schuchart had not covered, including the one of Ceylon, Daman, Bombay, Nagapatnam, and one song that was collected in Goa. In addition to these two major players in the second phase, you have other sources that could be mentioned. For example, a long and interesting collection of oral traditions from Ceylon, collated and published by Tavares de Melo between 1905 and 1914, and then other minor studies, let's say, that mention these languages and made use of the available materials by several of the most important scholars at the time. For example, the Italian Emilio Tezza, the Portuguese Francisco Adolfo Coelho, and others, such as William Gunetilica, who was from Ceylon, Jerónimo Quadros, who lived in Diu himself and commented on the materials of Schuchart, etc., etc. I want to briefly go back to Hugo Schuchart, because his epistolary corpus, his epistolary collection, is immensely rich for the Indo-Portuguese languages. All of his, or most of his materials, his publications, his manuscripts, but also the letters he received are nowadays kept in the Hugo Schuchart Archive at the University of Graz, where he last worked. And going through these letters is a treat. As you can see from this map he received letters about Portuguese or Portuguese Creole in all of these locations, right? So even though he only published papers about the ones in blue, so Diu, Mangalore, Cannanore, Mahe, Cochin, and Batavia and Tugu in Indonesia, he published, he started the manuscript that I just mentioned about Ceylon. But in addition to that, he has information, he has received information about all of these areas, including many places where the languages have since died out. And in some cases, the information that we get from these letters, which may not be a lot, is precious because it's the only one you can get. I'll give you an example, which is about the cluster of locations that you find around what is modern-day Burma, Myanmar, right? So places like Rangoon, Molmen, Tavoy, and Mergui. There is one particular letter in the epistolary corpus of Hugo Schuchart, which was sent to him by Paul Ambroise Bigondet, a French missionary who operated in that area. And Bigondet's letter is, to the best of my knowledge, I could be wrong, but to the best of my knowledge, the only concrete information that we have about Portuguese Creole being spoken on that part of Asia. The letter is transcribed in French on the right, but let's read the English translation. Sorry, the French is on the left. Let's read the English translation on the right, and you will see what I mean. So he writes to Schuchart the following in 1882. I regret to inform you that the Portuguese language, that is the patois honored with that title, has completely disappeared from Rangoon, Molmen, Tavoy, and Mergui, and to such an extent that I can hardly find a person in these 4 locations who can converse in Portuguese. When I arrived in 1837 on the coast of Tenasserim, I had to start learning the Portuguese patois to make myself understood by the Christians. But I soon realized that this language, barely understood by those who spoke it, could not be the means to impart religious instruction to the poor. Within 40-something years, the Portuguese patois completely disappeared. When I arrived in Tavoy in 1837, they used to sing Portuguese hymns during Christmas for Epiphany, but these have also disappeared. Several old men and women that I have inquired from with regard to these hymns told me that they remember hearing it being spoken when they were children. The salient characteristics of the Portuguese patois, as I found it, are first, near total omission of the article. Second, often the plural of the noun is unusual. Third, almost all modifications of nouns and pronouns are neglected. Fourth, the adjectives that qualify a plural noun have the singular form. Fifth, what designates past and future is expressed by 2 simple words, já and lá, added to the present. The final R consonant of the infinitive is always left aside. I regret that it is not in my power to give you more complete information or find someone who can do so. For this patois, in addition to no longer being spoken except in Malacca, was never written or studied, and was no more than lingua franca of the ignorant and especially of the seamen. Now, this letter, as you can see, is not very long. The information that it provides is not a lot, but is essential because the linguistic characteristics in red that are provided here allow us to identify this language as a Creole because they match what we know of the other Creoles, not just in South Asia, so the varieties of Indo-Portuguese spoken, for example, in Ceylon, but also in Southeast Asia, including the one of Malacca, which is mentioned in the text. So there is a lot still to be found potentially in archives of this type concerning this second phase of documentation. And now we move on to the third phase. So after the 1920s, there's a gap. So for a long time, there was very, very little attention given to these languages. They disappeared. There isn't a lot of production about it until the 1970s. And in the 1970s, the third phase starts, which I classify as being that in which modern documentation and description of the Creoles and of their oral traditions or oral traditions in these Creoles kicks off. There are many names to mention here. For example, there is a 1977 article by Laurencio Teban about the Creole of Korlai. There is descriptive linguistic work done by Ian Smith about the Creole of Sri Lanka, mostly the variety of Batik Law. There is also extensive work, descriptive work by Clancy Clements about the creoles of Corlai and Daman, especially Corlai. And then there is significant work about the oral traditions, including but not going beyond the Neville manuscript, done by, for example, K. David Jackson and Shihan de Silva Jayasuriya. So there's a number of different approaches to these communities and their languages, be it pure linguistic description or the description of their traditions. And by the end of the 20th century, this was the panorama, let's say. So when it comes to linguistic descriptions, the creoles of this area, which had the most advanced work done, were quite clearly that of Sri Lanka and that of Corlai. Ian Smith, in his thesis, 1977 thesis about the creole of Sri Lanka, was one of the main actors in this description. And for Corlai, Clancy Clements, especially in this book that you see here on the right, The Genesis of a Language, which is essentially a grammar of Corlai Creole Portuguese. So, but this is not the end of the third phase. So at some point I kick in. So I also start contributing to this documentation with work that I started doing first on the Creole of Diu, then on the Malabar, and finally, more recently, on Sri Lanka. And in addition to that, you have an interesting new dynamic of research on these languages, which includes, on the one hand, some work done on the resources that I collected myself. And that includes the work of Anna Krajinovic about the Malabar, the work of Patricia Costa, Mahesh Radhakrishnan, and Rui Pereira about Sri Lanka, but also work that is done on these languages and their communities, which are not related to my own projects, including the work of Sebastian Nordhoff, Bandara, Fernando, and Slomanson about Sri Lanka. So having said this, and because I was invited to talk about my own contribution to this matter, I would now like to tell you a little bit about my about these three projects. So my research in Diu, in Malabar, and Sri Lanka. Starting with the earliest of my projects about Indo-Portuguese, which was the one concerning Diu. This is a project that started in 2004 and was basically my PhD dissertation. So when I embarked on this project, very little was known about the Creole of Diu. There were the data that had been produced nearly a century earlier by, or over a century earlier by Hugo Cardoso, but there was no recent documentation or description of this Creole. So the intention of my dissertation was to write a grammar of it. And the Creole of Diu is spoken on the island of Diu. It was one of the longest lasting Portuguese colonies in Asia up until 1961, along with Daman and Goa. And it is spoken by a very small number of people on this island, about 180 speakers, including children. And you have a photo there of some of the youngest speakers at the time. They have since grown, of course, who were school children at the time and were some of my own collaborators in this project. And because the intention was to write a grammar, I did the classical documentation and description project. So I went in, I did field work, recorded not just free-flowing speech, so uninhibited to the extent that it's possible, uninhibited speech, but also elicitation sessions that were designed to fill in the gaps, the descriptive gaps, and allow me to produce a relatively full, or as full as possible, description of the grammar of this language. You have some of the equipment there, just in case some of you are also field workers. You will recognize that this is what was used back in 2004, and some of it is now considered obsolete, such as the mini discs. And so one of the things that I did was record as many people as possible speaking the language, so that I could have a basis on which to build my description. Here's a very, very short clip, a very short sample taken from a story that was told to me by one of the children that you saw in the earlier photo, Stephen Almeida. So this was collected about 2005, I believe. And let's hear it. So whenever I show you a sample here, I will always give you the transcription of what you will hear, and then a translation into English. Let's hear it. And please let me know if it doesn't work.
Macaque e crocodile. E que macaco tem vai, ele tem vai no jungle para trazer coisas. Arroz, tudo. Ele tinha loja, ele foi trazer arroz. E ali tem mar, ele viu crocodile, né? O crocodile disse assim, onde vai? Ele disse que eu vai agora não comprar arroz, depois da arroz eu vai na casamento da minha irmã.
Right, so this gives you an impression of what one of these languages is like. Exploring how it differs from Portuguese would take way too long. But if any of you are speakers of Portuguese, I think you will recognize that, you know, even though the lexical basis is clearly Portuguese, this is a very, very different language. So this corpus of recordings that I collected for my PhD in DU were the basis of descriptive work, obviously, because that was the intention. And one of the resources that I produced was my dissertation, the one that you see here, which is essentially a grammatical description of DU Creole on the basis of the materials collected in the field, including all of the elicitation that I did with as many speakers as I could. Another interesting resource that was produced around this time and into which I was able to input my data from DU is something that some of you may know. It's the Atlas of Pidgin and Creole Language Structures, an initiative of the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig, organized by Susanna Michaelis and a team of scholars. And what this is essentially is a large database of comparable data for, I believe, 80-something Creole languages and Pidgin languages around the world. It's available online and printed as well by Oxford University Press. And since I had already by then finished my descriptive study of DU, I was able to include it in this resource. And in fact, what these dots on the map indicate are the languages included in the atlas, and the colors indicate their lexifier. So the ones in yellow are the ones which have Portuguese as the main lexifier. You can see that there's a number of them included in the atlas, but the Indo-Portuguese ones, so the ones of South Asia that are included, are the one of DU with my own data, the one of Corlai by Clancy Clements, and the one of Sri Lanka by Ian Smith. All right, so moving on to the second project. This was an unexpected project, let's say, which began in 2006 while I was working on my PhD dissertation about DU. And what happened was that I think in 2005, during one of my field trips to India to work on DU, I was in Goa, and in conversation with some people there, I heard rumors that perhaps there were still speakers of Portuguese on the Malabar coast in Kerala. And this was news because it was assumed by everyone that I had read before that the creoles of the Malabar were extinct and had long been extinct. But I still decided to go and check, and lo and behold, I did find a few speakers, especially in two locations, in Cannanore and in Cochin. Now, the interesting, the most salient feature of this particular language at this particular time is that it was and still is on its very, very last legs. So it is spoken by very few people, So, and the speakers I could access were essentially the last speakers. In Vaipin, which is a region just off the city of Cochin, I was able to interview and record and work with the man who seemed to be the last speaker in that region. His name was William Rosario. And as I told you, he passed away in 2010. So to the best of my knowledge, there are no longer any speakers left in the Cochin area. I've heard that there might be, but I couldn't find them. In Cannanore at the time, I found only 6 speakers, and they really are the last ones in that region. And eventually, I also interviewed someone in Calicut, 1 speaker, but this speaker is actually a sibling of one of the people in Cannanore who moved to Calicut. So even though we're dealing with a very peculiar situation in which there's only a handful of speakers left, this language was of interest for many reasons. And one of the reasons for me, one of the most important ones, was that the creoles of the Malabar may be the earliest of the Indo-Portuguese creoles, because this is the area in which the Portuguese language first became established and contact began. So most of the speakers that I could work with lived and still live in this area of Cannanore called Barnecheri, by the sea, not far from the Portuguese fort. And here is also a sample. This language is considerably different from what you heard in Diu. And this is just a bit of a story, the beginning of a story told to me by Rita Neto, who lives in that area. Let's hear it.
Pokan madanse, gato com rato bomba camratini. Olo tu casa dentro tin fica. Akla rato ja gato spacha fala. Agar chuve sauce nosku horn pavai. Akasuida agar vaikande noski zar kere sigra garda. Olo tu butiga jafai la grandi unjar dentro. Manteiga chipidi. Manteiga pidi kandu o igrejas parto building tene quebrado casa. Ala jafai kan jo kubri garda. Si jab fazakanda casa ratna javi.
So this corpus of recordings of speech collected in the Malabar, especially in Cochin and in Cannanore, are still being dealt with. So descriptive work is being done on the basis of it, not only by myself, but also by a former student of mine, Anna Krajinovic, who has published about a section of the grammatical description of this language, and also Clancy Clements, who eventually visited Cannanore with me and also contacted the speakers. So this is still work in progress, just like Diu is still work in progress, even though we've now added other locations and field data collection elsewhere. One of the striking conclusions of this work, this descriptive work on the Malabar Creole, is that it is in many ways very similar to the Creole of Sri Lanka that we already knew, because as I told you before, it was reasonably well described by then. And these similarities between the two areas, the languages in the two areas, are not universal, obviously. There are very, very big differences between the two, but some essential linguistic characteristics are the same. And one of the most important one is what you call, in terms of their syntax, the head final syntax that characterizes them, which means that, for example, typically the verb comes at the end of the sentence, that typically they have postpositions rather than prepositions. So these are all linguistic characteristics which are modeled on the languages of the region, Malayalam in the case of the Malabar, and Tamil, and also Sinhala in the case of Sri Lanka. So syntax is one of the areas in which you see these similarities, but another area that I bring here so that you have an impression of what it's like is the lexicon. So there's a number of concepts for which the Malabar and Sri Lanka have very similar terms, so terms derived from the same source, Portuguese source, where the creoles of the north, Korlai, Daman, and Diu, have words that are consistently different. And those include the words for dog, friend, language, room, think, this way, side, and a very interesting term that is used in the Malabar to refer to the Malayali people, and in Sri Lanka to refer to the Tamil people, which is Malvar, derived obviously from the name of the Malabar coast. Okay, so on the basis of this, I have been working on this hypothesis of the southern cluster, a cluster which, based on linguistic similarities, would establish a strong connection between the Malabar and Sri Lanka, and potentially all of the other Indo-Portuguese creoles of southern India, which no longer exist. But this is a hypothesis that we are working on. And since we mentioned Sri Lanka here, my documentation of Sri Lanka is my third project. It's much more recent. It started only in 2015, and it was, in a sense, like a logical continuation of my trajectory up until then, especially when I started working on the Malabar and noticing all of the similarities between the two languages. I decided that since the end of the civil war in Sri Lanka, it might be finally possible to restart documentation, that is the production of records on Sri Lanka. And this is how my latest project called Documentation of Sri Lanka Portuguese was born. It started with an exploratory visit in 2015, and then it consolidated in a large project, collaborative project between 2017 and 2020, funded by the Endangered Languages Documentation Program, which at the time was being run from the SOAS, and only recently moved to Berlin. So what I intended to do with this project was, unlike my previous projects, I didn't want to work solo, let's say. So I wanted to create a team. And because of that, I also wanted the documentation to be more varied in its objective. So in addition to creating a corpus of modern spoken Sri Lanka Portuguese, I wanted other dimensions to this project. This corpus is available. We recorded and treated nearly 50 hours of speech, involving over 150 participants. And it's available at the Endangered Languages Archive for anyone who wishes to use it for their research. But in addition to that, I envisaged this as a interdisciplinary project that would also record and research the Burgers' music and dance traditions. Initially because, well, first of all, these songs are in the language that was the topic of our documentation, obviously, but also because music and dance, as Dr. Shihad da Silva Jayasuriya can very well tell us, are one of the most recognizable features of this community in Sri Lanka. So for the purposes of cultural and even linguistic preservation, this made sense. In addition to that, we also wanted to conduct a sociolinguistic survey of the community to find out how endangered the language is. And we wanted to collect archival sources about this language, and they've been deposited, and some will still be deposited in the future on the Endangered Languages Archive. So now, very briefly, because I know that I've been speaking for a while, some of the features of this documentation project were that, unlike in the previous ones, we were able here to use video quite a lot. So most of the materials are video rather than just audio. And we tried to have as many diverse settings as possible in our interviews and recording sessions. So you have some examples here of photos which were taken from videos. And in some cases, we have groups of people speaking, sometimes only one person. Sometimes it's an interview in which the interviewer himself or herself features. As you can see, I'm in one of those photos. And if you look at the picture on the bottom right, what this represents is that a lot of our recording sessions were actually dynamic, in the sense that we asked the participants to do something. So this lady, for instance, is cooking one of the traditional foods of the community called foforochi. But in other cases, we had people telling us and showing us their trades, their crafts, such as, for example, blacksmiths or carpenters. We have priests showing us around the church. So there's a host of different settings that we try to include in our recordings, and our recordings look something like this. I'm going to show you a little clip of a conversation that we had with two ladies, Philomena Jonathan and Juliana Kelly of Trincomalee. And they are telling me about wedding traditions of the Burgher community. So let's hear it.
No anda primeiro canto. Andate noivo se pai chamatando landa. Akalai noiva se pai noiva pa chamatando landa.
Noivo Carlo
manda.
Noiva se casa.
Assim lá anda tona studio panda vintra este video nada no tamana studio anda foto tutira casa lovi ravana vai kinimpa etespa chamatando
tria baila.
So all of these materials, audio or video in this case, were treated, as you can see in this slide, using a software that some of you may be familiar with called Elan. All of these interviews were transcribed and then annotated in several domains, in several different layers, let's say. So you have a word-by-word translations, you have morpheme divisions, you have morpheme by morpheme translations, then you have a translation into English so that someone who doesn't speak Sri Lanka Portuguese can still use the materials and try to find out about a particular topic or a particular linguistic structure. And this is how the materials are made available on the archive. There was also, of course, even though the language was already described by the time we began our work in Sri Lanka, there was also descriptive work done. And just to show you what we've been able to add, what you have here is the Sri Lanka Portuguese pronominal paradigm. This was taken from a recent publication by myself and my colleague and collaborator, Patricia Costa. And what it shows you is the different pronouns and pronoun forms for nominative, oblique, and genitive. And the forms in red are the ones that we retrieved from our corpus, which had not been documented before, right? So we already had descriptions of the pronominal paradigm, including the forms in black. But because we now have a large number of speakers and also different areas, including the city of Jaffna, we have encountered forms that hadn't been reported before in the literature. So this is only to show you that the corpus that we've collected can still be explored for many different domains, and not just for linguistics, because since in addition to the music and dance, which I'll show you in a moment, other disciplines can also profit from it, because in our interviews we try to talk about many different topics. So we have we have people talk to us about religion, about daily life, about chores, about education, about the life of women, about you name it. There's a number of topics there that can be explored beyond linguistics. Music and dance, as I told you, was also part of the documentation. And we were specifically interested in documenting two genres associated with the Burgher community, the lances, but especially the cafrinha. And what I will show you here is a little clip of a cafrinha performance from our archives. Okay, so this particular performance was recorded in Batik law, but we also have materials, music and dance materials from Trincomalee and songs collected in Jaffna. When it comes to the sociolinguistic survey, the survey was done especially by a student and collaborator, Rui Pereira. He's still finalizing the analysis of the documents, but what I bring you here is are two of the essential charts that come out of this sociolinguistic survey, the ones that have to do with fluency, because one of our intentions with the sociolinguistic survey was to have concrete information about how endangered this language is, to what extent it is being transmitted to the younger generations or not. And this survey, which was filled in by 3,094 people, shows that when it comes to fluency, only 26% of the Burgher community in the eastern province of Sri Lanka can be classified as fluent in Sri Lanka Portuguese. 16% can be classified as partially fluent, meaning that they can often understand the language but don't really use it or have difficulty using it. But the majority of the Burgher population no longer has any fluency in the language. And if you look to the right, to the chart on the right, you will see that this is the distribution of fluent speakers by age group. And what you can see is an age progression of fluency, which is quite clear, right? So you have much lower fluency in the younger generations and much higher fluency in the older generations, which is a clear sign of language decline. But you also have significant differences with respect to this among the three districts in which we applied the questionnaire, the districts of Batticlove, Ampara, and Trincomalee. So the situation is not the same across the region where the language used to be spoken and is still spoken. And for instance, in Ampara, you can see that the situation is a little more dire, and in Trincomalee, it seems to be a little more vital. So this brings me to the end of my talk. I would just like to show you where the archive is and how you can access it, because all of the materials, or most of the materials anyway, are publicly available. On the ILAR archive, which you see on the left here, the ILAR archive, the Endangered Languages Archive, contains comparable corpora for hundreds of languages. This is only one of them. And you can access our materials there if you're interested. And also if you want to hear news about the project and what's become of our, or what's being done on the basis of the materials, you can follow our page on Facebook at Sri Lanka Portuguese. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Hugo. That was so interesting, so rich and meticulous. So I think we all, really, it was a treat for all of us language lovers. We are really, I think, we are replete with a lot of information of different kinds to take away. I know I'm supposed to give a response, which I'm delighted to do so. I've taken notes while you've been talking, and I've collated some ideas. I'm going to speak for about 10 minutes because I know there are people in the audience who are, I'm sure, interested in also, you know, taking the discussion forward. So my response will really take the shape of a few observations and some questions. So, I mean, kind of, they're both interchangeable. The observations can also be turned into questions if you like. But mainly what I wanted to say, as somebody who is not a linguist, but is somewhat of a linguist monkey, as you know, I'm constantly veering towards linguistic issues. My early training was also quite strongly linguistic and philological. So I'm very, you know, these questions always kind of fascinate me. But what I do also as a literary critic and a cultural historian is I do like to think about the larger significance of some of these micro level investigations and such as specialists as yourself have, conducted. For me, I see the story that you're telling us. It's quite a hidden story. Very, very few people specializing in South Asian literary, history really given any time of day to the idea that at one time even there was such a profusion of Indo-Portuguese creoles up and down the coasts of South Asia. It's another story that there is this, it's a story of decline and reduction, maybe also of decreolization, but that's something to even think about. You see what I mean? If you don't even start with the realization that they were there in the first place, we don't even start to ask why then did they go? And what does that also signify for cultural politics and cultural history? So I see the most important contribution of the empirical work you've done and the analytical work you've done and the classificatory work is to allow some of us to take seriously the idea of Creole in South Asia as an interruptive and a counter genealogy to many of the, kind of like received narratives about what is post-coloniality, for example, in this space. And also, of course, it's also an interruptive counter-genealogy for certain ways in which we conceive of the colonial past, So in that sense, we are getting more and more aware of what Saugata Bhaduri from JNU is. He recently called polycolonial histories of Bengal. He was just looking at Bengal. And this, in your map, we have the little cluster up there in Bengal, in the Hooghly district of Chandranagore, Chinsura, Bandel, and Shibpur, where we have historical traces of Portuguese creoles. And this is precisely the space of Saugata Bhaduri's exploration of polycoloniality. And he is showing the evidence and presence of all these colonial powers jostling in that space of the Hooghly district of Bengal. As something to take seriously and counter what he calls the monocolonial idea, that there was only the British Empire, that somehow we see it, we see colonial history in India as dominated or exclusively a kind of product of British intervention, and there isn't really any room to think about all the other European powers that were also present at a certain point. But counterfactually, of course, we can ask what would happen if the British had not been reigning and if the Battle of Plassey had not been won by Clive. But those are, the issues are that at a certain time they left sedimentations of culture, and linguistic presence is language is one of those places of sedimentation. So the descriptive work and the analytical work around Indo-Portuguese creoles, even if all of it has disappeared almost today, it doesn't matter. That sedimentation tells us that we have to think about the colonial past differently. We cannot be content with the monocolonial reading of the South Asian past. So what does that mean is really my interest. Coming back to the post-colonial present, as we know very well, the way the colonial past is imagined has a deep bearing on the post-colonial, on the way the post-colonial present is also imagined, and indeed utopian futures thought. So the idea of nationalism, I think, is kind of an interesting, is dialectically, I think, in tension with these Creole evidences that you bring out. Very simply, from what you are showing us today, there is a relationship between Sri Lanka and the south of India vis-a-vis these Creole, the southern cluster that you are identifying. So what do we do with that? On the other hand, of course, even the evolution and gradual disappearance or decline of these creoles can't be thought of simply in terms of these were the Indo-Portuguese creoles. Even in the small excerpts that we heard, we had definitely Anglophone words there, like crocodile and jungle in the first one, and there were some others in the southern, in the Cannanore Creole as well. I can't remember, but I noted that you were blocking them. They were not italicized, and those are the words you were signaling somehow that they come from the. I mean, there's a clear interference of English, there in the way those words are even pronounced. You wouldn't pronounce them like that if you were just speaking Portuguese Creole that had no interference from any other language. I think that was the logic of it, but correct me if I'm wrong. So even in the very microscopic way, we see how there is a kind of, even the story of creolization is also interrupted in itself by the polycoloniality, if you like, of the space that is South Asia. And in its own way, that throws another spanner into the works of nationalism and nationalist ideas of genealogy. You know, who were we and who are we now? I think in that sense, a fascinating issue really, and I'm pursuing that myself in my own research on Creole Indias, is how these early Creole communities, which were obviously created around the speaking of Creole languages, sort of segued into the category of Anglo-Indian, you know, which would seem to be coming from a totally different trajectory altogether, as the term Anglo-Indian would indicate. But as we know, there was a collapse of categories. So there is a lot of really teasing out to be done to show how the linguistic map of South Asia can take us far beyond the ethno-linguistic boxes that we are very used to commonsensically dealing with when we think about the federated map of India, for example. And I also see Javed Majid here, my colleague from English, who of course has done a lot of work with, again, the pioneers of all that kind of ethno-linguistics of India, like Grierson and so on. So I think there's a real dialogue here to be had between people like scholars like Grierson and the scholars of Creoles that you were talking about, like your namesake, Hugo Schuhart. And I do think those are also very fascinating complications in the history of scholarship of colonial languages itself that all this perhaps takes us to. So I'll end my responses here with a series of little queries. Feel free to take them up, or we can open the floor if there are questions and you can, address them. We are having our conversation for years now, I'm very happy to say, so we can always address these queries in another way too. But I think the biggest elephant in the room for me was, where is Goa? What happens? We would love to hear from you why there isn't even a declined and disappeared Creole of Goa on your map. That's the big question I have. I think the other questions are to do with why, in your opinion, was there this dramatic decline of Creoles, so that we are literally down to no speakers of, the languages are getting extinct, as you have yourself done your research. So this is kind of something that I would like to know your own views on. And in relation, in a way, why was at a certain point, at least, the Ceylon Creole so vibrant and, prominent, and such that there is still a living culture, though alas, even there we see a kind of attrition, as you showed sadly in that last slide of yours with those graphs. The final observation then I'll make, which is also a question, is that, how far can we push all that we know about creolization through linguistics to make us take seriously, creolization as a heuristics of culture, as a way to understand and reinterpret cultural interactions. If we take the space of South Asia, even the word Caipirinha, reminds us that there is the African in the mix, because Caipirinha is coming from the word kafir, which is of course not at all a word to be used without quotes these days in South of Africa, but it's a word historically that was used for the Black African communities of the Indian Ocean world. So the dance, which is basically a creolized quadrille, as I have studied, a kind of, Europe, which has the African imprint in it, and the name is carrying that. And there are so many words that the word paranki, which is used in the Malabar coast for the early Creole communities, is from Firangi, which is an Arabic word. So, we start with Portuguese, and we've got the others, the binaries, the Indo-European languages or the Dravidian languages, but there's so much more going on. And isn't that also what creolization as a heuristic to understand culture can alert us to? So I'm going to stop there. We can, you please feel free to take these, to take my questions and respond to them, but there are issues, there are comments in the chat. Is there anyone who would like to ask questions? Please raise your hand, while Hugo may want to say a few words in response to my response, and I'll check if there's anybody who wants to ask a question. Hugo, thank you again.
Thank you so much, Ananya. I think we're really on the same wavelength here, because what these communities and their languages reveal is as you said, complexification, right? So this complicates the ideas that you were talking about, that there is a predominance, for example, in India of the impact of the British, or in a different dimension, even people who deal with specifically with Portuguese colonialism in South Asia are often not aware of these byproducts, which cannot be understood as the results of two highly segregated communities, the Europeans and the locals, but are the result of porousness, right? And this porousness is so vast and so obvious that, as you say, includes all sorts of different influences. So the African influence, of course. And I have to say that on the topic of the African presence in this part of the world and of its impact, of course, one of the specialists is here, Dr. Shihan da Silva Jayasuri. She can tell you a lot more about it than me. The fact that you have words of different origins that pop up in these creoles. So, for example, you have terms which used in the Indo-Portuguese creoles, which are ultimately from the Southeast Asia. And likewise, you have terms in Southeast Asia which are clearly South Asian. So there are these dimensions of transportation, transformation, reintegration, reinterpretation of certain terms. It's very complex, and it doesn't sit well, as you were saying, with ideas of purism and nationalism, right? It's much more complicated than that, because what you find in the spoken language is something that you often don't find in the written language. So if you look at documents produced in Portuguese or around that from this area, you will not find this kind of interferences. This was something of daily life. This was something of the lives of people who, some of them might not even have been able to write. So it's a different dimension, perhaps more perennial dimension of contact and exchange. And it's interesting that you mentioned the Anglo-Indians and that switch, that classificatory switch and grouping, which is, to the best of my knowledge, which is a kind of a product of British colonial reinterpretation and relabeling of communities, right? The same thing, in fact, happened in Sri Lanka with the Burgher community, right? Which also, much like the Anglo-Indians in South India, Burgher in Sri Lanka initially also congregated all of the Eurasians, let's say, right? But it's interesting because when you start digging deep, you will notice that the Eurasians are actually of different extractions, and they also interact between themselves, and you have Dutch words in Sri Lanka Portuguese, and you have a lot of English, of course, in Sri Lanka, in Malabar Portuguese. So it's very complicated, and that's the beauty of it, is that it is complicated. It's not just two categories, one European, one Asian, living side by side and having no interaction. It's the opposite of that, I would say.
Do tell us about Goa.
Goa, yeah, Goa is complicated because if on the one hand you can assume that if creoles cropped up in all of these areas, Goa would have been one of them. The fact of the matter is that you don't have any significant evidence of it, except for something that I mentioned briefly, which is a song that Delgado was shown, and apparently it had been collected, he thought had been collected in one of the monasteries of Goa, and he wrote a paper about it because it struck him. He was Goan himself, and that the language in that particular song struck him as very Creole, as very different from what Goan spoke. And his interpretation was that perhaps that was what he called a Cafrial Creole. That is, that was a song that must have been associated precisely with the African population that was, in his interpretation, quite significant in some of those religious institutions of Goa, and especially the convent of Santa Monica. That's his idea. But we have a lot of evidence of linguistic interactions between Portuguese and Konkani in Goa. They're everywhere. There are different varieties of Portuguese in Goa, but we haven't yet found evidence of something that is comparable in its grammatical overhaul to the Creoles coming from Goa, except for that particular song, which, as I said, Delgado interpreted as being associated not with the Goans themselves, but with the African population. But it's an open question. I wouldn't be surprised if some archival data popped up somewhere in the future about Goa.
Well, we'll wait then for that exciting moment. But in the meanwhile, I think it's certainly a fascinating issue that we see a lot of creolized culture in Goa, as far as I have observed it. But there is at the moment, and there are lots of words, there are hundreds and thousands of Portuguese words in Konkani, but they don't, as you say, transform syntactically or overhaul the grammar to become to be able to get labeled, I mean, as defined as a Creole or even a pidgin, I guess. So, it's a fascinating thing.
There is, if I can add, there is another dimension here, and this is an idea that's been floated by some scholars from Goa, is that there was something peculiar about Goa. Being the center of things, there was, first of all, a larger proportion of Portuguese speaking people living there than in the other areas. There is also a much bigger Catholic community than in the other areas. Therefore, it's more stratified. And being more stratified, there was also the potential for the acquisition of Portuguese to be more effective, let's say, among certain parts of that population, and other parts of the population being left out from these means of the promotion and the expansion and the teaching, in fact, of European Portuguese, standard Portuguese, right? So there's something about the social structure of Goa which is significantly different from these smaller places that we are dealing with, where whether the populations, the Catholic populations, the Indo-Portuguese populations are smaller, therefore they have to be closer. They have to be closer knit, right? So there's also something to be said about that. But as I say, these are all very interesting questions to think about further. I don't have an answer for you.
Wonderful. Well, we'll keep hounding you. Don't worry. I do have a couple of questions in the chat. I think we have a few minutes we could ask. So I don't know if you can see Clifford Pereira's question, that he's been looking at Luso-Asian movements and settlement in Southeast Asia, especially Flores, Timor, etc. To what extent, he asks, is the linguistic map related to the migratory map?
Well, first of all, hello, Clifford. We've met before, and we've also had a chance to talk about these things. Yes, your question is also my question. As a research question, I think it's one of the most important ones, because Creole language, so the Creole linguistics has in other areas of the world already produced results in terms of giving hints, linguistic hints, which then are confirmed by historiographical data and even genetic data concerning population movements. And even in Asia, as perhaps Clifford, you will know, even in Asia, there's been a lot of research about how the Southeast Asian Creoles share a lot of similarities from Malacca to Macau. That's very clearly linguistically attested, but also historiographically attested. So there seems to be a correlation between linguistic similarity and population movements, but also between Malacca and, as you mentioned, Dili and Flores and Batavia, etc. So the Southeast has been explored to that extent, and some clear patterns have emerged. What I think has not been sufficiently explored, and I would like it to be now that we have more data about Indo-Portuguese Creoles, is to what extent those migratory movements and linguistic links actually extend to South Asia. Because if you look at the map that I showed you with the Portuguese setting up base originally in the Malabar, and then from there expanding their exploration of the rest of Asia, it does make sense that linguistically as well, there would have been some sort of impact from South Asia onto what happened in East Asia. And the reason why this link hasn't been made clearer in the past, I think, is because a lot of these varieties were not sufficiently described, right? So Sri Lanka was well known, Korlai was well known, but the others were not. And I think now we're in a better position to do these comparative studies and try to understand to what extent all of these languages have something to do with each other. Therefore, what does it tell us about population movements, right? Having said that, there's already been some comparative work done. And one of the most interesting conclusions actually goes back to one of the questions that Ananya posed. It is that these locations that we've shown here have had very different colonial histories, right? So whereas in the Malabar and Sri Lanka, you have the typical Portuguese, then Dutch, then British succession, right? In Daman and Diu, you don't, because you have basically the continuation of the Portuguese colonialism until 1961. And the results the linguistic results are quite different. So what you find in the South and in these places where the Portuguese were politically moved out and replaced, is that these Creoles have had more time to accept and incorporate more of the features of the local languages, which are dominant everywhere, right? So that's why you find a typological structure in the Malabar in Sri Lanka, which is much more South Asian, than in Diu and Daman, which is much more European. So these the historical dynamics of contact and lack of contact with, in this case, Portuguese, have a significant impact on linguistic structure, right? And that's one of the most interesting things for me. But I think this link between linguistics and history is one of the most fascinating aspects that we can explore.
I was saying that's why we need these collaborative conversations and ventures. So there's one little question from Alice, and maybe we should end, or I'll after that question, maybe I'll hand over to Vinicius. Alice is asking, do you have any ongoing research projects?
Well, actually, all of these are ongoing. They started in different periods, but they're all ongoing. So there's still stuff to be done about Diu. I sort of put my research on the Malabar a little bit on hold when I started the Sri Lanka project, because it was very, very time consuming. I was very involved in it. But now I'm slowly going back to my data from the Malabar. And for instance, there's a paper coming up soon about the Malabar. So there's a lot to still do on the basis of the Malabar. There isn't yet a full grammatical description of that language, which is one of my long-term projects. I'm still working on Sri Lanka. I have people working on Sri Lanka with me, so PhD students, collaborators working on Sri Lanka. So these projects, once they're started, they never really end.